Welcome everyone to another edition of Book Talk. Unfortunately, Cynthia can't join us today because she has a bad cold, but we will record the event, and she's missing a great opportunity to see Marshall in action. He is a longtime bookmaker, the founder, one of the founders of Booklyn in Brooklyn, New York, which is a major mover in the book arts world. Marshall has his work in collections all over the world. Egypt, Great Britain, France, Library of Congress is a big fan of his work, Stanford University, University of Washington, and of course here. Marshall is going to give us a new look at book art in that he also does a lot of performance art. He does endurance performance art in the streets around the world. And I don't think we'll be having an endurance performance here today, but there'll be some physical interaction, which is fabulous for book arts. So anyway, welcome, Marshall.
Thank you. I just want to thank Cynthia and Amy and the staff here at the museum and all of you for being here, making this possible. I've got a little protocol that I use, so before I start any public speaking, I would like to acknowledge that this meeting is being held on the traditional lands of the Squamish and other indigenous peoples, and I recognize their continuing connection to land, water, and community. I pay respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. This acknowledgement of indigenous peoples is something that I do before any public presentation around the world, and it gives me a chance to actually investigate and explore the local histories of every place that I speak, and I do a lot of international speaking. I learned about this in Australia, and in Australia all public events start with an acknowledgement, and I think it's something that should probably be part of every culture. So I've been doing it here in the United States. Another artist, Michael Rakowitz in Chicago, is very well known for doing that as well. And what's interesting about it is, again, it introduces you to the history of every region. And so having lived in Olympia for a year or so now, it's been very interesting looking at the indigenous cultures and their impact on me as an artist, as well as the general culture. Other notes for today. When we look at the work today, I'm going to ask you to kind of take a different approach. Typically when we're looking at artwork, we're thinking about it. But I'm going to ask you to not think about the work, actually, but just to instead experience the work, and instead of thinking about it in an intellectual way, I'm going to put a little bug, a little seed in your minds to just experience the work as it triggers memories in you. What does the work mean to you? What memories come up when you look at the work? I think this is kind of just a little idea that I want to kind of swim into your consciousness. One other thing before we start is I'm very interested in context, and it's very interesting for me to walk through the museum and see all the different exhibits and see how many of them are about the environment, ecology, nature, which of course this is an emphasis of the culture of the Northwest, but I think that it's really informed the book arts as well, as you can see from the work in the shelves here. Well before other mediums, I think the medium of papermaking is so attached to the natural environment that it's really informed the book arts a lot, and I think you'll see lots of resonance with that. What I'm going to do today, I actually have 4 new books, which I am kind of thrilled about, and I'm going to present these in sort of a performative way because they're big books, and it gives me a chance to recite and a chance to kind of show you one of my interests, which is expanding the book from a small, intimate object into an installation or an experiential object. I do a lot of work in performance art. I've done a lot of work in video. I've done a lot of work in installation and collage and poetry. And I'm very interested in just how the book is really a theatrical experience. I mean, the book doesn't work unless we drive it. And I've heard a lot of interesting metaphors about book structure. You know, some books are kind of like a Ford truck and they're kind of rough and all-wheel drive, and some books are like a Porsche. And if you look at the books here and imagine not just what the content is in terms of visual form, but how you actually have to handle them in different ways. You have to dance with the book. You have to activate the book. And I'm very interested in that. So for instance, the series I'm working on now was very much kind of this melding of popular youth culture and larger events. I'm very interested in addressing a millennial audience as well as other audiences. I think it's interesting here today. We see a lot of women in the house, and there was a little discussion earlier of why women are so attracted to the book arts. If you look in the shelves here, you'll see a full representation of women artists. And it's interesting to me, and especially where our country is at this time, that women's issues, feminist issues are really at the top of the nation's concerns for various reasons. And the book arts has always been a place that has supported women's work, in part because there always was a tradition of women working in printmaking and book publishing all the way back from Mesopotamia, where you have one of the first women poets. So why is that? Is it the intimacy of the form? Is it the fact that women were also kind of kept out of the larger, more spectacular mediums like painting and sculpture, and traditionally had to work a lot harder to get into those mediums? Printmaking and book arts has always been very welcoming to women artists, and maybe in part it's the issue of librarianship. When we think of librarians in a conventional way, we often think of women. When we think of school teachers, we often think of women. Now, whether this is true statistically, and it certainly is a generalization, there is kind of an element of the fact that artist books are really attached to teaching, to libraries, to intimate issues, to tactile issues, and to the domestic craft vernacular, whether it's, you'll see a lot of embroidery here, you'll see a lot of paper cutting, doilies, Mexican paper cutting, collage, sewing, all these kind of elements that in some ways have been associated with women's craft movements are present in the artist book. So with that context, we're going to jump into some new stuff that I'm bringing you. This book is called The First Hit, and it's sculptural in a sense, but as is my primary affection, it's still a codex book. I do a lot of street photography and primarily portraiture. So these pictures are pictures from nightclubs kind of around the United States and little landscapes of the city of Seoul, and a little photo essay on poverty and the shore of New Jersey. And these are unique books where I'm digitally printing these large-size photographs and I'm folding them up. I'm changing kind of the dimensional approach of the images. I'm really interested in controlling the visual field. So we open this book and we've just got the one line that introduces a very short poem that makes up this text. And it's the title of the book, That First Hit. I have an interest in kind of consumerism and its relationship to addiction, to militarism and its relationship to addiction. What is that thing that first hooks us in any particular moment? What are we obsessed with, and what was the thing that got us there? So this little moment of celebrity here, this young woman is on a float and she's crowd surfing. The reason why she's on a float is because there was many instances when crowd surfing became popular where women were groped while they were crowd surfing. So one DJ's answer, Steve Aoki, this is one of his concerts, he would put out these beach floats, and then the women would get on the beach float and they would crowd surf around safely on their float, which I thought was a really interesting, sort of fun, beach kind of nightclub weirdness. And of course the floats really absorb the light and bounce the light, and so becomes this kind of like 15 minutes of celebrity. So I was just really interested in how much celebrity kind of emanated from this one young woman's experience. I mean, she's Madonna, she's Lady Gaga, she's like everybody for 15 minutes floating around the crowd, and then she's back down into the miasma of it. So this book is about this kind of dance scene, and we just open up with lots of close-ups. And then there's kind of the other side of addiction, which is, you know, the end of the line. What happens when you hit rock bottom? And there's a little mini survey of kind of impoverished towns around the New Jersey coast. And what I was doing is I took about 40 different photographs, I cut them up in a puzzle form, and I put them together to make this little collage that offered this counterpoint. Now, I like alternative page structures. So what we have here is this giant fold-out to this larger-than-life-size image of this dancer, which is doubled by the smaller image. Now, on the back here, we have, God, give me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference, which is, of course, is the serenity prayer most closely associated with Alcoholics Anonymous, but with lots of other recovery groups as well, and also just with general kind of Christian practice. So again, I'm using this found text in the same way that I would use some of these procured images to form more of a collage, more of a montage. And we continue into this page here, where it's a very simple end line, enter dreamscape. And this really is kind of what it is all about in terms of, you know, what is that first hit about? It's about escaping. It's about entering the dreamscape. And in this particular moment, the dreamscape is the city of Seoul, this gigantic. I mean, I thought New York was a big city, and then you go to a place like Seoul, and there's neighborhoods that are as big as Manhattan. And you can just go from neighborhood to neighborhood, and each one of them looks like an American city. Cities of like 14 million. It's just kind of overwhelming. But I'm very interested in the details, and so there's an interesting component here where this young woman is keeping her cell phone in her bra, because you have to have it with you at all times, even when you are dancing. And if you're really jumping up and down, you can't keep it in your shorts. So, you know, and then if it goes off, you feel it, right? Even if you're like with all this loud music. So these kind of aspects of youth culture and its incorporation of technology into kind of like athletic practice that I thought was really interesting. So then we continue, and we just go off in this one page. I was really interested that kind of the element of worship that's happening here between all these people holding up this young woman as we're sending her around the stadium, as it were. And again, the book offers lots of different ways to display. So we can go and have the Serenity Prayer come out and form the context for us here. And so the book becomes an architectural form, which extends it into the gallery as kind of an exhibition piece. So I want to give you all permission to interrupt at any time and ask questions, because I will go on and on and on and on and on and on. And I'm interested in what you have to say, and I want to make sure that you know, my points are clear. So feel free to interrupt at any time. I'm going to pass these around. It's going to be a little unwieldy because they are kind of giant, but feel free. I don't believe in gloves or anything like that. These are all archival prints on archival paper. They're pigment inks, which means they're you know, an acrylic base. They are really hard to damage. And so it makes them kind of the perfect template for books that are supposed to be handled.
What kind of glue do you use?
I use PVA, which is polyvinyl acrylic, and I like Jade brand because it is just a little thicker than a lot of the others, so you can water it down to how you want, as opposed to letting it, you know, when you, some of the thinner brands that they have, you have to wait, you know, weeks for it to like settle. And
Yeah.
but Jade is really thick, and so you have the option to get it to any consistency you want.
Marshall, are they mounted on bookboard?
I use bookboards for the covers. I tend to use a 280 gram weight paper. I like really thick paper, whether it's a Hahnemühle BFK or a Moab photo coat paper. I tend to use coated photo papers for the digital prints, and I really like printing paper, higher weight printing paper for my books. My books tend to be like fewer pages and more structural, unless they're kind of this found object thing like the bar mitzvah album being passed around.
Okay, thank you.
The other thing...
You have to be present to demonstrate the book.
Oh, no, not at all. And as a matter of fact, most of my work is unique or very small editions, so I'm usually not present when the book is used. And in some ways, I really like people experimenting with the book.
So they explored stuff.
So they just explore. We were talking earlier about the Library of Congress, where you can go there and check out any one of my books that are there. You can check out any of the books there, and they bring it to you, and you get to handle it. So there's a lot of exploration that goes on. And I tend to like my work to go into public collections, whether it's museums that have library programs or libraries that just are accessible. So I try to make them so that they are handleable. And, let's hope they last a few hundred years. And we can go from there.
And we hope that
We can revisit, and in a few hundred years we can revisit the situation.
Do you make multiple copies of these?
Usually they're unique.
Yeah.
So sometimes, for instance, the bar mitzvah book there, I made a facsimile edition on handmade paper made from the documents that I didn't put into the actual book. We just shredded those so that they're kind of like still existing as part of the edition. But primarily I make unique books.
What paper is this printed on?
That's a Moab photo coat paper, yeah.
Photo coat.
Most of the pages in there. I also work with the binda Sarah Parkell, who got her MFA from the Alabama State University program, was a board member for the Center for Book Arts in New York, was one of the founders of Booklyn, and is now a lead conservator at BARC, which is a big art conservator in Queens. And she does amazing work. I've worked with her for 15 years, and so I can give her a pile of stuff and say, Sarah, make this into a book for me, and then I'll get the book back. We kind of agree on the design work, and very often what will happen is I'll have a stack of pages, I'll have a text block, and I might work on that for a year or two. I'd have like a dozen different projects going. At some point it will coalesce into a finished text block. And I'll send it to Sarah, I'll get together with Sarah, she'll bind it, and then I will work on the book after it's bound to kind of finish it off, tighten it up. So this book is called Incandescent, and it's got this amazing snap binding here. That was Sarah's idea. And it kind of opens up, again, like a little stage. And I'm using these giant prints of kids from the Frankfurt Book Fair who are in cosplay. They're in costume as various Japanese anime characters and manga characters. I'm really intrigued with kind of the idea that the book is like set in its place. And so instead of just like floating in space, it's like this woman is actually coming up out of the table at you, So, and then she's in these kind of multi-dimensional spaces where, the rest of her body might appear in another place in the book. And just kind of, it gives you kind of a feel of action, and then here's the title of the book. And typically I'll try to not have a title on the cover, and the title will be introduced in either the first page of the book or even further on. And this is Incandescent. And so Incandescent, it says, we're rock stars in our own lives. We're not making anybody money. We're saving the world, doing what we want to do, and we're making love. We don't act like celebrities. Celebrities act like us. Actors want to act like us. We're not entertaining anybody. We're for real. We're not online or on stage. We're not in films. We're in the streets and in the woods. The sun is our spotlight. The stars shine on us. The moon winds our clock. We're comets, we're meteors, we're fireballs.
Was that written in 1960?
Yeah, by me.
You
So-
wrote that, so you wrote that
Yeah, I
in that script.
yes. I tend to write my own text, or I tend to absorb texts from various sources. And then some people have politely called me an experimental calligrapher. But I like the idea of developing my own hand. I've never trained in traditional calligraphy, although I did work with the Chinese artist Xu Bing about brushwork and how to hold the ink brush. And I use a traditional Chinese style of ink brush approach, but I do not use any traditional letter forms. My idea is that when I'm writing in my books, I'm trying to evoke the characters. Like, this isn't my writing, this is her writing. So I'm trying to like act. This is another element of the performative nature. I'm trying to take on characters. In terms of the subjects of my book, I would think, how would this person make an artist's book? How would they write their text? What would they say? And then we continue out, and you can see the rest of the faces come up. Now, another aspect of how these books work is that you have this kind of exquisite corpse, that you can have the writing present as you look at the whole book. So it gives you kind of different ways of engaging with the text and the images. And then everything is kind of like handleable, so you can always move stuff around in different combinations. This book was finished late last night, and it's good to have deadlines. And so you'll smell the ink. And I think part of the whole practice is, it's almost like you're unwrapping a gift. I love this idea of having to handle things and even struggle with things and move around with them. And again, to me, it's the dance with the book. And it's the same dance we do with every book we look at. We just don't really think about it because we're so used to doing it. I mean, when you're, reading Vogue, you're not thinking about, oh, I'm reading this, I'm opening the pages. Oh, somebody designed every one of these pages. Oh, this design is actually standardized across the entire magazine industry. I mean, if you look at page 55 in Vogue and page 55 in GQ, chances are you will see the same page design. So, we don't necessarily think about those things, but it's always present. I mean, one of the reasons why people like magazines, and this has been established again and again, as the magazine industry just refuses to die, one magazine closes, another magazine opens up, is that people engage with the tactile process of reading books and magazines. And there's some very recent research that says people might even remember intellectual material better when they are tactilely engaged with the book.
Instead of reading
As opposed to reading a screen or not having any tactile engagement.
Because it uses more parts of the brain.
Voila. So,
Or felt or firing.
the way this series works is I'm kind of, since I do a lot of unique books, I kind of see the books as all related, and they're very often parts of series. So the Bar Mitzvah book represents one part of a series of autobiographical work. And then this particular, these incandescent books kind of represent a new body of work that's kind of exploring things that are in my field of focus now. And it starts with this kind of looking at addiction and looking at popular culture, and then moves into this, further idea of, what celebrity is and what the lack of celebrity is. And so it's kind of, it's going to get a little dark here in this third installment of this series. And this book indeed is called The Dark. And this particular collage is an interesting piece. Because I get to travel out, I get to work with a lot of artists, and I do a lot of collaboration. So this particular piece, this is a photograph that Tim Page took in 1967 in Vietnam. And this is a photograph that Tim Page took in 1998 in Timor. So there's a lot of history going on here, and I was interested in kind of the contrast between black and white and color, and how one immediately looks older and how the other looks a little bit more contemporary. And there's whole stories behind this that I'm not necessarily going to explain to the reader. I'm not necessarily going to, as someone mentioned before, I'm not going to be there to show these books. So there's an element of mystery. There's an element where I just think of a collage, for instance, or the structures of my books aren't necessarily fragments that are put together. I see every piece of the collage as just being a window into this whole other universe that are all woven together. And you're getting to see a little bit of it. So you're not going to get to see this whole picture, but intuitively, your brain kind of knows it's there, in the same way that you might conjecture about where this picture is from. Specifically, I'm not that concerned as an artist with the specific facts of history as much as I am with people's emotional response to the imagery. So the dark opens with this kind of very mysterious, but I think evocative collage of, it reminds me of George Orwell's, what if the future is a boot in your face? And kind of has some resonance for me. When I first saw these two scraps of photo tests lying on Tim Page's studio floor, I was just like, can I have those? And he was like, of course. And then 4 years later, I was like, this is the cover of the book. So we open up into the dark, and we open with a large monoprint. And this is actually made from a wax rubbing of a plaque of the Chrysler Building. I've kind of made these submarines. I'd like this idea of this kind of undersea object just immersed in the dark. And if you look very closely, you can see the title of the book is Black on Black through this image. So you can see the dark. Now, there's a few, once again, my books tend to have alternative ways of entering, so you can open to this page here, and we have this kind of, now we've turned into this like precipice pointing at these characters. This is an image done by my daughter, and I very often work with her. And then we fold out into this very enigmatic triptych involving an X-ray and some other wax-worked monoprint. And there's kind of a enigmatic mystery for me in this image, and sometimes I can't even explain. The work kind of operates on some subconscious level, whereas I'll be manipulating these materials into hundreds of different arrangements, and then I'll strike one that says, oh, this, I don't understand this image necessarily, but this works for me aesthetically, and I'm just going to ponder that and leave it up to the audience to put it together. So again, because we have these alternative structures, we can have this reference image here at all times, or not. So this we go into the next page spread, and it says, I am still falling. And then there's this little weird, here's another total art no-no. This little tab here is exposed. So it pokes out from the binding of the book, so it's always getting wrinkled up and stuff, and that is just such anathema to the art world, and especially to the print world. But I want this book to show the wear. I want to have the delicacy evidence, because what this is, this little 343 here, this is a piece of stationery from the 9/11 memorial, not the big memorial, but the Firemen's Memorial across the street of the World Trade Center, which was the first memorial to actually go up. And it has all the names of the responders who died in the 9/11 tower explosions. There were 343. And at the beginning of this mourning period, they made this fantasy brigade for these 343 firemen. And so they had this little insignia that they made for them. And then they actually had, they still sometimes refresh this, but they kept out pieces of paper and pencils, and you could do rubbings from the names of the different firemen if you were related to them or you were just interested. I went and spent quite a lot of time there, but I was doing rubbings from the actual bas-relief sculpture because that was very interesting to me. That I was more interested in kind of the faces and the visual aspects. So I am falling still. I mean, it's obvious where the references are here. Now these are this is like where close reading comes in. I want the book to be able to operate in terms of like, many people have said to me, oh, that's a really beautiful image. And I'm like, yes, it is. There's something mysterious about the human face fading. But a closer read also reveals kind of the personal tragedy of the image. And then this is actually a portrait of me by the artist Alison Melberg. Kind of the portrait is the poet burdened by the words in their head. So again, there's specific and really kind of, I think, universal themes that I like to have present in my work. I'm really interested in being able to be responsive to social and political events happening. And so I usually have about 12 projects going in my studio, or if I'm traveling, in my suitcase at any time. So things happen, and I like to react to them, and I like to kind of, also beyond reacting, I like to kind of imagine alternatives to things, or I like to process things through my work. So last year was kind of a tough year for me, and I would hazard to say the country. And one of the things I did was a lot of drawing and a lot of ink brush painting, more of this experimental calligraphy. And when the musician David Bowie died, who I had loved since I was about 8 years old, it really deeply affected me. And so I started to I spent about 2 or 3 months just writing lyrics of his songs on big pieces of paper that, this is actually Strathmore watercolor paper, so it's like thick. And one of his songs that always struck me because it seems resonant in my life is, we were talking about learning curves earlier. And so this song is always crashing in the same car. And, which is kind of a version of like insanity, which is defined as doing the same thing again and again and again and thinking you're going to have a different output. That's kind of my learning modus operandi. I usually have to make a mistake about 100 times before I'm like, it doesn't work. So I like the idea of, again, I call a lot of what I do difficult reading. Like, I think this is a beautiful image. I just, to get this image, I took a brush and I dried sumi ink on the brush and I formed the bristles into a pattern that then dried, and then I dipped that brush into ink, and it's what makes these patternings. So I very often do this kind of formed brush work. And whether you can read it or not, at a certain level, the universal level, is kind of immaterial to me. I mean, it's about the gesture, the performative gesture. The same reason that we can appreciate Japanese or Chinese calligraphy without actually knowing the meaning of the words. I think we can do that with English and the Roman alphabet as well. So this book, again, we tend to have these phrases that form the text of the book. So, I am still falling, always crashing in the same car. You think the dark is something. That happens when the sun goes down. So, the cadence of the poem, 3 lines, is fairly clear. What is the dark? And again, using various aspects, the interaction of the sumi ink with various photo-coated and other types of paper give us all these different textures. And then this is a fine Japanese calligraphy paper. mounted onto this Reeves BFK. So when you're feeling these books, you're feeling all these different tactile surfaces, which I love. Now here, we end as we began. This is our little immersed submarine. It's down deep, deep in the dark, and yet it's glowing. Now this is a wax rubbing from a plaque of the Chrysler Building that I've doubled and then hand colored. And it is from this wax rubbing that the beginning of the book was actually printed from. So that wax rubbing was inked and then printed the front of the book. Now, of course, I'm not always there to explain all this. But again, I think the aesthetic integrity for me, from the specific to the universal, is that there is an intuitive notion. When your brain sees this pattern and your brain sees that pattern, whether you're consciously aware of it or not, there's a pattern matching function of cognition that's like, this pattern is the positive of this negative. So I think this is what actually is part of the cognitive and neurological structure that lets us read in the first place. It's the element of pattern recognition that has to do with, like, is that a bush or is that a tiger? You know, it's really important for your brain to know if it's a bush or it's a tiger. So in the same way, it's like, is that a letter form or is that a scribble? This is the same kind of neurological trailway. So it's from pattern recognition that we get letter recognition. So I'm always kind of trying to play to those kind of neural and cognitive pathways. So there is the dark. It's a little heavy. Oh, sorry, bad pun. So from the dark, I was like, wow, that's a bummer. We need to like lighten this up. We need some good news. And so again, having these projects around, last week, November 7th, was an election day, and there was some very interesting news. So we stepped into this dance here. And again, this is a giant, giant prints that I'm manipulating. And again, trying to evoke the dance. Trying to evoke the fact that you're dancing with the book, you're dancing with the subject of the book, literally, you have to have your arms around the book to engage with it, right? It's a very intimate, human kind of practice. So here we have a book that is titled, "If I Can't Dance, It's Not My Revolution," which is a quote attributed to Emma Goldman, although she didn't actually say that. But it is a paraphrase of a response that she had to a young, very zealous anarchist when she was at an event, and she was dancing like a crazy woman, which she is known to be a very exuberant dancer and a very athletic person. And this young man went up to her and said, "You are not really acting in a dignified manner for an anarchist leader, and you need to like chill out." And she gave him this entire lecture about how, emotional exuberance and celebration had to be part of any social or revolutionary movement. And that kind of got distilled down into popular culture as if I can't dance, it's not my revolution. But I think the sentiment is there. Why fight for anything that isn't fun? I mean, we are serious issues in terms of the specifics of whatever social issues or ecological issues we're dealing with are very serious. But ultimately, it's about fun and pleasure. We want to make the world a nice, fun place for everyone, and that is a universal goal that everybody can agree on. And there has never been a social movement that has been successful without having universal goals that everybody, except obviously this one young, really uptight dude, could appreciate. Like, I think that there are certain cultures that are not really supportive of dancing, but I think in general, as one of my grandmothers used to say, it's a kind of little paraphrase of Emma Goldman. She was like, "I'm a Baptist, but I'm the kind of Baptist that dances." So as we open up, we get into some topical kind of histories. And a young woman named Danica Rome was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates, which is the Virginia House of Representatives. And she was a trans woman, and so she was one of the first trans women elected to this house. And she said something really amazing that I want to read, that I wrote into this kind of, gigantic ink rotation, which there's a punchline to it later on. To every person who's ever been singled out, who's ever been stigmatized, who's ever been the misfit, who's been the kid in the corner, who's ever needed someone to stand up for them, who's ever, because they don't have a voice of their own, when there was no one else who was with them, this one's for you. And if you look at her speech, she's so emotional that it's breaking up. She's like pausing. There's all kinds of, she's going back on her words. And it was just so human to me. And I really was like, how do you evoke that graphically? Like, how do you evoke these issues? What are the universals here? The rainbow flag is kind of a universal here. Just that cadence. And it becomes a universal issue because it doesn't matter who you are. There's a point in your childhood where you were like, nobody likes me. Mm-hmm. So you appeal to this universal issue, and it's something that we can all understand. And I really love the way she evoked that.
Tell us her name again.
It's Danica Rome. So then we continue, and again, we have that possibility of different kind of orientations of the book. So there you can see where our rotation ends. It ends with Lady Liberty. And what is the primary universal here again that our country has, really established as the bedrock of what American democracy is, and that is with liberty and justice for all. Not for some, not for a few, but all. And I love that. Another thing Danica Rome said was discrimination is a disqualifier. And I thought that was very interesting. So we continue on, and again, we have different ways of evoking these texts. And now we move to another page spread of text. And again, it's like, how can we graphically represent kind of human emotion? And so this particular piece is, as an African-American trans-identified woman, I know firsthand the feeling of being marginalized, left out, thrown under the bus. Those days are over. We don't just want a seat at the table, we want to set the table. Mm-hmm. And this is Andrea Jenkins, and she's the first openly transgender woman of color ever elected to public office in the United States of America, elected as Minneapolis City Council person on November 17th, 2017.
This is all your writing, right?
This is all my writing, yeah.
Yeah. Chinese brushes again?
Chinese brush style, which is standing, vertical holding of the brush,
Okay.
and freehand movement.
Yeah.
Now, my friend Xu Bing would be like, but, yeah, that the idea is that you are open to any emotional cadence because you have no other support. So everything that the brush is doing, and in the idea of Zen, it's about your core. The brush is being moved by your heart as much as it is by your mind. So kind of, again, trying to incorporate the emotionality in the actual gestural work.
I think it's interesting that you had quite a bit of control, actually, because look at the way woman slips under the F in African, right?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of what you're doing, and also there's an aspect of, oh, did I do this 10 times or 100 times? Or did I do it once? And how much time did I practice before I did it? I mean, there's elements where you need to jump off that cliff. At 1 o'clock in the morning last night, I needed to jump off that cliff, and I was like, I'm doing this page now. And this is one pass. Again, a unique book, a one-time only kind of a deal. And you'll really smell the ink on this one. But in a way, it's, how do we incorporate history, which happens every day? And in millennial culture, history happens every minute, right? Every Instagram post, every Facebook post. I think, especially younger people live in a world of constant history. And sometimes it's hard to focus back in that. And so I'm very interested in I don't see one as negating the other. I think the idea of the classics and the idea of Twitter, I mean, these are networks of human knowledge, and I kind of see them as a level playing field. And this is why I can have these rave dancers next to the Statue of Liberty. And so as we continue through that, we get to some local politics down here. And this is something that Jenny Durkin said upon being elected the first openly lesbian mayor of Seattle. Donald Trump, keep your hands off Seattle. Sounds pretty simple. But then and it's actually, as I wrote it, I was like, oh, gosh, that has such incredible resonance, because she's using a very particular metaphor. I mean, she's using it politically, she's using it in kind of a feminist way, she's using it as kind of a reference to his little fingers, and there's just so much packed into this. And if you know anything about Jenny Durkin, you know that she knows everything. She is precise. She is a historian. She is a policy person who is very specific about her politics. And you know that she sat down with her campaign crew and was like, okay, how many different metaphors does this refer to? I mean, you can kind of see, if you've heard her speak, you could see the wheels grinding as she talks. She is extremely confident and learned. And I think it's a great kind of thing for the city of Seattle. I think she will do well.
Why did you choose that particular font for Donald Trump?
I didn't want to write the name. I just didn't even want to see the name. No matter where, how you feel about Donald Trump. I think if you are a supporter of Donald Trump or you're not a supporter of Donald Trump, I think across the spectrum, we might all be getting a little tired of Donald Trump. Even if you support him, I can understand. There's some people that just get too much press. So I kind of thought, well, how can I contrast the sentiments, make the reference graphically kind of indicative. Again,
It's intentional and intuitive at the same time.
yeah. I mean, because a lot of the work that I'm doing in terms of calligraphic style is you're not necessarily within the constraints of the calligraphic style. You are trying to evoke emotional and even spiritual kind of content with how you do the letter forms. And this is another element of Zen calligraphy, where it's a spiritual practice. So I think that the idea is, I also don't, I'm trying not to go into more really obvious kind of skulls for the, just things that are kind of, one, a turn off or too simplistic or not open enough. You want to be able to engage people in the work across a spectrum. So there's a little thing here, again, some black on black. I love black on black. I mean, as an artist, it's the worst thing you can do. I mean, Goya's black paintings weren't showed for centuries. I mean, nobody really dug those paintings. Black on black is you can't reproduce it, which means you can't take slides or scan it and put it up on the internet. It's just so much of my work is irreproducible, which I really like. It's unique. You got to see it. So here's a little black line. It says plur. And plur is just such an old-timey kind of 1990s phrase from the rave culture. And it just means peace, love, unity, respect. And I always loved that. It shows my age. And then we just go out. And typically, the only kind of crediting I'm doing, it's very interesting within the fine press tradition. Very often people ask, where's your colophon? Where's the credits for the book? And I'm like, I think of my work more as artworks, and I sign it, but I always give credit to my binder, Sarah Parkell, who I work with collaboratively, even though she tells me not to do that. And she's really like, don't tell people I'm a collaborator, I'm just the binder. So I think modesty is a really great kind of lesson. So it always kind of keeps me in check, and I always give Sarah credit on the books because I think not only does she make the frame for my work, but I think she makes a lens that kind of amplifies it. And what I want in terms of the structure, like she actually knows how to bind. Like I bind some of my books and they work, and it's like that Ford Ranger truck thing, whereas she binds the books and it's like the Porsche thing. Like, yeah, there is a difference between a Toyota Corolla and a BMW coupe. There just is. And when you drive it, you feel it. And sometimes you need a truck. And sometimes you need a coupe. So this is, if I can't dance, it's not my revolution.
Is that last photo a crotch shot?
Hmm?
Is that last photo a crotch?
No.
Or, oh, it's the shoulder?
Yes. I'm big on arms
Okay.
because I like that.
Just
Because
wondering.
I usually try to have an aspect of the imagery reflect the structure of the book. So I like using arms, I like spines, I like things like that because the book has a foot, the book has a spine, the book has wings or arms, and I think what the codex is an essential reflection of the human body, which is why we like them so much and why, oh my gosh, I lived through decades of people going, the book is dead, the book is dead. One of the things that really drew me to the cosplay culture, for instance, which we primarily think of as like dress up, right? Kids and sometimes young adults dressing up as cartoon characters. But a major part of the cosplay culture is kind of this weird book worship. Like at the Frankfurt Book Fair, manga comic books were so popular over the course of the 80s and 90s within the children's book hall that the managers of the fair actually started a cosplay contest, which is one of the biggest cosplay contests in the world now. If you come to Frankfurt as a kid and you have a costume or you have the makings of a costume, you get in for free. And it's 35 euros, so it's like $50. So you have thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of children from all over Europe going to the Frankfurt Book Fair to buy books and to compete in these cosplay events. And they all bring their own sketchbooks because there's an aspect of cosplay called the sketch-in, where you sit down with tons of people and you do sketching. So when you're at these fairs and you're like looking at these kids, they are lined up. There's thousands of people lined up to buy books, and they fly in authors from all over the world. But they always have big backpacks, and they're filled with books and sketchbooks. And then if you need to take their picture, they're like, oh, they have to take all this stuff off, and then they have to do their pose. But it is a book culture. It's
What
just
a wonderful thing
What,
to know.
what time of year does this happen?
Frankfurt Book Fair. Gosh, when does Frankfurt happen? It usually happens in October, because it's usually right after or right before Oktoberfest. It's also a complete nightmare. I mean, you're talking about millions of people converging on this city, and it's the primary licensing venue in the world for books. So there's a lot of books, but there's also a lot of guys running around with contracts, and women too. Like, there's a lot of like signing of stuff, a lot of signing of papers. I mean, you go, just remember, and it never stops. It's kind of relentless. I actually don't do it anymore. It's too much. I mean, I don't have to do it, so I don't do it. But, you know, I just recall at one point being at like some party at like 2 o'clock in the morning, and it was like a skater kid party, and I was a lot younger, which is why I was there. But literally there was like a guy, and they were like signing a contract in the middle of this dance floor, and they were just, the agent who was like wearing this, you know, Gucci suit was like signing some skateboard kid's photo book contract in the middle of this dance floor, and he just like had someone come over and he just put the contract on his back and had the kid sign it. I mean, it's crazy, but it's about books, and so this idea of the book being dead is just dead. So a lot of the work I do is collaborative. And I'm showing you some personal projects, but they have aspects of collaboration within them, whether working with my daughter and Tim Page is in the dark, or working with my family archives in my bar mitzvah book. 5 minutes? Perfect. So this book is called Kill Them All. And it's a book done with Stephen DuPont, who is one of the only photographers in the world to win both the Robert Gardner Award and the W. Eugene Smith Award, which are the two biggest humanitarian reportage awards for photography. Steve and I have been working together for many years. Typically what happens, I'll be in Australia, I'll be in his archive, we'll go through work, he'll give me a few hundred pictures, I'll carry them around the world, I'll do drawings on them, I'll do rubbings on them, and then I'll form these collage pieces. So this is all work from Afghanistan. And what I'm doing is I'm framing the books with ink paintings and a poem of mine that I thought again kind of expresses like universal concerns. So this is how it goes. Empire of tears, built on salt bricks, distilled from blood and sweat, drained from sons and daughters. Who desired these oceans of suffering? Who would deny love?
Who wrote the text?
I did.
You did.
Yeah. We brought the towers down upon ourselves and turned the earth to dust. So this is a giant accordion fold book. And then on the back of the book is an ink painting. And the ink painting says, all suffering is caused by our everyday actions. So I'm very involved in kind of Buddhist theologies, and I always wanted a counterpoint. I always feel hopeful about these things, and I feel like reportage is a way of explaining things, not to focus on the problem, but so we might imagine a solution. And Stephen is an amazing person. He spent a lot of time in refugee camps. He has a book out with Steidl, which is 19 years of his photography in Afghanistan. And he does amazing things. So he does a lot of Polaroid portraiture. And his modus operandi is to take the picture and then give the positive to who's ever sat for the picture, and then he prints from the negative. So there's always an exchange. Very often he'll take photographs somewheres, and then he'll go back there and give out prints to the people. So it's a very interesting kind of practice as a statement, as a photographer saying we need to be on equal footing. He always gets permission for people for his photographs, even in conflict zones. So he's a really interesting person to work with. This piece, of course, is a gigantic accordion fold. So we can take it, and if you march it down the table, you can get an idea of how it works as an installation piece. And so on one side is this ink painting, on the other side is really what becomes cinema, right? We're trying to make a film here where the text and the images produce this narrative. And we end up, I think, with a very lovely picture of these two young women in a refugee camp. And the look that they're giving is really indescribable. But it really both expresses trauma and hope. And I think that on that note is where I'll end in terms of like, I think we're in hopeful times, and I think that art is a way to imagine a hopeful future. And I am, thankful for all your support so that we can all continue in imagining this hopeful future, that all this work that we're surrounded by, and indeed in the entire museum, really is about that hopeful future. So, thank you.
you.